Howdy, everyone. Welcome back to the Old World podcast with Will Tanner. Today we have more of, I guess, a new world subject we're going to be discussing, which is the state of the youths with Jay Burden, who, as many of you know, he's an awesome podcaster, has a ton of interesting guests on interesting topics, covers a wide variety of stuff. So he's a really interesting guy to talk to, and I'm excited to have him on. Jay, could you introduce yourself and kind of introduce your background for people who might not know you?
Yeah, sure. So I am Jay Burden of The Jay Burden Show. I post interviews a couple times a week. And much like you, I have been in right-wing circles for quite a long time at this point. I don't know if you and I really count as the youth anymore.
Yeah.
Even by the most generous measurement, we're kind of on the upper end of it. But nonetheless, right, we are still within the same generation as those kind of, rising up through college now, and have some similar touch points, and I think a similar view towards politics generally. The answer is, okay, well, where are the youth at? The answer is on both extremes. We see a lot of extreme far left politics, particularly around gender with Generation Z, although that, interestingly enough, has declined pretty significantly. Seems to have reached its high water mark in about 2020, go figure, with roughly 15 to 20%, depending on who you ask, identifying as, quote, a member of the LGBTQ community. We understand that a large portion of that is a girl who kissed another girl at a party once saying, I'm bisexual. But still, right, the fact that 15% of people in any group would claim that indicates some sort of sea change. Now, one, I will say, that trend has already reduced dramatically. It seems to be around 5 to 6% now, which is, again, this is according to a graph I saw on Twitter with a study link that I did not read. But nonetheless, it seems as if that trend has decreased. Now, look, in general, the maxim that younger people are farther to the left than older people is true. But it is much less true than it should be. For instance, Generation Z, particularly men in Generation Z, are significantly to the right of millennials at the same age. So given overall trends, cohorts tend to become more conservative as they age. It seems as if Generation Z, by the time they are in their 30s to 40s, will be significantly to the right. Now, when we talk about them being on the right, does that mean that they are Republicans? They are GOP types? Well, yes and no. Your viewers are no doubt aware of a series of leaks published by Politico. First was from a Young Republicans group chat on Telegram. The second was from a Trump appointee. I cannot remember what he did, someone I hadn't heard of before. But in each one of these cases, they were saying naughty things, right? Making jokes about, prominent World War II leaders, referring to, certain racial categories as watermelon Americans, things like that, generally being edgy. And the reaction was really, I think, telling, because for anyone our age, the reaction was, oh, yeah. Oh, them too. Yeah, pretty much. Like that sort of humor and that kind of culture towards, I guess we could say, like the moral priorities of progressive America is very common among young people. But similarly, the reaction, where at least for a large part of the conservative movement, there was this desire to sort of castigate themselves, to throw these kids into the fire. The New York GOP, I believe, disbanded their Young Republicans chapter. Many of these people lost jobs or lost the opportunity for jobs. And so this is not to say that the Republican Party is becoming some sort of hard right organization, but to say even within their own talent pool, the people who you would assume would be the most likely to stick to the party line, there's a significant gulf. There's a significant gap. Now, I've mentioned multiple times Gen Z men in contrast to Gen Z women. That's an interesting part. Politics has broken down along sex lines. The war between the sexes has been, really raging since the late 60s, has really metastasized with people our age. You see this in the data on how many people are having sex. The answer is not many. And look, we could, as social conservatives, talk about this and maybe adopt a different tone. But let's be clear here. These people are not abstaining from sex because they are, chaste, sort of saving themselves for marriage. They do not go outside. Yeah, exactly. They're like gooning to like anime pornography on Discord. This is not exactly, these are not people, in monasteries, right? So point is, men and women have become political classes in the same way that workers or the bourgeoisie were in a recent era. And men as a class have become right-wing coded. You see this in kind of internet tabloid entertainment. For instance, like the Whatever podcast, where some guy just berates OnlyFans sex workers. I caught myself there. I didn't want to use a rude word. It just harasses them. Just calls them names for. And look, these women are stupid. But what is he selling to his audience? He's basically selling them outrage over the state of women. And similarly, the same thing exists for women. Look at the Substacker Cartoons Hate Her, I think. I don't read it. It's marketed towards women, but it is basically a woman going around finding people, particularly men, saying outrageous things about women and posting it to her audience so everyone can get upset about it. So there is this culture and this like monetized, I guess, entertainment ecosystem around a divide between men and women that obviously has a political bent to it. And so when we talk about where is Generation Z, it really comes down to, well, who are we talking about? Because in general, Generation Z women are quite on the left. Now, there's, let's be honest, widely differing degrees to which that is active. A large portion of it is just, that's what quote unquote good people do. And so there are a lot of women who are Democrats, but not really political, just sort of going along to get along. And on the right, you have a lot of men who are right leaning, but again, not particularly political. It's more the Democrats are gay and cringe. Mm-hmm. And I think another relevant feature with this, and you saw this immediately after the election, where even the Democrats themselves understand that they have a problem reaching young men. They hired an overweight Hispanic woman to go around to frat parties. I don't think that worked. And I think that indicates one of two things. First, they realize they have a problem. They understand that this is a demographic that if they don't get now, they are unlikely to ever reach men, young men within a certain age bracket. But also, they have no idea how to actually do it. They genuinely don't understand them. They're like, oh, well, I would be interested in playing beer pong with a aging 300-pound Latina. So clearly, a frat at Old Miss would be. And obviously, like, it's laughable to say it like that. So I think that rift is probably irreparable. And a large part of it is that there's really no narrative that the left can sell to young men, particularly young white men. Like, who is your guy? Who are you supposed to be like? Really, the last thing you had, and this guy's star is faded, but is someone like Vouch. It's like, oh, well, you can be like a debater, a guy who knows all the edgy left-wing things to say. And you can be like him. But he's been replaced. He's not special anymore. There's a new streamer in town and, he's brown, so he gets to say things that you don't say. And you can be a fanboy for that guy. But you, as a white guy, you're nothing. You're at best consistently apologetic. Look at that. Is Harry Sisson? I don't know how to say his name. I've only seen people saying horrible things about him on the internet, so I don't actually know how to say his name. But point is, that's another example. It's like, can you be him? Does anyone want to be him? Like, it's this embarrassing kind of effeminate, self-effacing, like democratic twink. And so I think a lot of it has much more to do with that fact that for the left, for the Democrats, there isn't a role to step into. So if you want to be a part of that coalition, you can either constantly be apologizing for yourself, constantly explaining that you're one of the good ones, that you're an ally, or you can make a change. You can be gay. You can start wearing a dress. You can be non-binary. And yeah, sure, you can do that, but that's kind of embarrassing, especially when even then you're never going to be at the top. You're never going to be given a fair shake. And so I think there's a push-pull going on there. There is both, a recognition that, many young people are getting a raw deal. You see this with, economic data on, housing, access to jobs. And you've done great work on this, right? Just talking about compensation in relation to hard metals, for instance, right? That your dollar and your average wage is worth less. So you have young men who are dissatisfied, and traditionally, economically dissatisfied young men end up on the left, right? They end up as, communists or anarcho-syndicalists throwing bombs at Russian czars. And okay, it's not a good thing to do, but at least there's an understandable relation there. Well, if those same people are saying you are the problem, you're why it's like this, you are, deeply contaminated with the original sin of, settler colonialism, white racism, pick your poison. And you will never be on our side. Well, okay, that's a big reason why young guys would be pushed the opposite direction. Now, similarly, I think that a very relevant factor as well is when men in our generation grew up, which is basically we were in school, particularly in high school, during the Great Awakening, right? The rise of the woke movement sort of midway through Obama's era, certainly through the Trump years, where that extreme vein of social progressivism was all consuming. And you couldn't go anywhere without being told that you are a problem by the world's most irritating people. And so again, that creates, when you add in a certain level of teenage rebellion, a desire to be the exact opposite of that. Like I think of my experience in the first place I went to undergrad. I ended up dropping out because of this and another experience where I was forced to take a social justice class. And I remember sitting through it, just feeling like, what am I doing here? Like I was paying a lot of money to be there. I worked really hard to get in, and I was surrounded by people who clearly hadn't, who had gotten there for other reasons, being lectured by the most ridiculous stereotype of a blue-haired, overweight feminist. And I had this crisis. I was like, this can't be what college is about. Like, this can't be real. This feels like a practical joke. And so that pushes a lot of people to the right. So anyway, when we look at Generation Z, where they are, the women are in general more to the left than men. Men are, on average, to the right. And when they go right, they go quite far right, as shown in the Young Republicans group chat, as shown in, just the internet. If you've ever been there, you see it. But also you see this in trends around religion. So you've seen this in Europe, that there are more and more young people in church, which is bizarre. Europe has been, relative to America, sort of unchurched. And within that, where are they going? Well, we see that young men are going for, effectively, authoritarian religious institutions. The traditional Latin Mass, Orthodoxy, high church, Protestant denominations. And that's interesting because historically, more women than men go to church in any given era. Normally, it's about a 4 to 6% female advantage in church. Women are on average more religious. And so the fact that there are more men in church is unprecedented. It is also unprecedented that there has been a return of young men, not just to church, but to the most demanding forms of religiosity. It's an interesting dynamic. And to me, it indicates that this group is already quite to the right of culture. And given the general trend that groups tend to become more conservative as they age, it's no shock. And I think a large part of that is effectively growing up in the culture that the previous generation, millennials, wrought, both in education, right, during the Great Awakening, but also being, depending on who you ask, either the first or almost the first generation to grow up in a minority America. The culture that you are always being assured is the root of all evil is no longer really the default. It becomes more and more absurd to blame whatever that is, that fleeting part of America, for all of the problems we see multiplying year over year. So sorry, Will, I've given you an unbroken 15-minute rant in answer to your question. But yeah, that's sort of my initial thoughts on it.
Yeah, no, that was great. I didn't want to interrupt because you're on a roll. One thing I did want to follow up on was you mentioned, you used to have the split between like the workers and the bourgeois, or however you want to define that, like the proletariat and the others. One thing that I think is interesting there is if you ever like break that down in terms of how true it was. In America, for example, the coal miners were a disparate group. On one hand, you have the people Mortimer describes in that Who's America episode, where they're causing havoc, and a lot of them are Scots Irish or black or Poles or whatever. But then on the other hand, you had
Thank you for differentiating, by the way, between the between those two groups.
But then you also have the miners who actually did the mining instead of just carting stuff around. They're primarily English, sometimes Welsh, paid better, and they actually weren't leftists generally. They more voted with like the more racist conservative parties. And it's an interesting split because there's different dynamics going on there. Do you think in the general like divide you're describing, whether between men and women or like younger and older conservatives or however you want to break it down, do you think there are splinter groups off of those that like separate it or define it down somewhat in terms of like what people are more likely to experience in their daily life? I know that's a rambling question, but if that makes sense.
100%. Like all of the same, demographic categories still exist. When you're talking about something as broad as a generation and then even as gross as male or female, of course. What I think you've seen as well in that is that one of the things that separates young right-wingers from their conservative parents and grandparents, particularly, is a change in attitude around race. That historically conservatives have genuinely dreaded conversations about race because it was a conversation they always lost. And a large part of that was that, at least in some small part, they genuinely saw themselves as being in some way on the wrong side of history. That they sort of felt a certain amount of unease. They felt a certain amount of trepidation because they didn't want to be evil. They didn't want to be on the wrong side of history. Whereas for good or ill, people our age and younger do not feel that same compunction. So I think that is a massive shift in attitude. And you see that in interactions between different subgroups in Generation Z. Again, we're talking in the grossest possible terms. But look at the way that, these kids were joking. Now, look, they were joking. I don't think they were genuinely fans of, that certain Austrian fellow. But in that joke, you see something true, which is that it's no longer like special or sacred for them anymore. Like, I even think about this. Did you make 9/11 jokes in high school?
Of course.
Yeah, of course. And that was something that happened, when we were in high school, maybe 15 years at the earliest, right?
Mm-hmm.
Before we were in high school. It had already passed into the realm of something that it was acceptable to joke about. And you look at, conservatives, even, not to say all, but conservatives in their, 40s and 50s, Hitler is not something you can joke about like that. World War II is not something you can joke about like that. That is still like that's off limits. And so you can look at that and say, well, it's not the most serious critique. It's not, nor is it intended to be. But I think we're seeing a shifting understanding of what is effectively a legitimate target for politics. Like, what are you allowed to discuss and debate anymore? What is considered sacred and off limits? And that really is the death of, whether you want to call it the post-war consensus or democratic norms, which we heard about a lot, especially during the first Trump presidency. He's violating democratic norms. And, well, was he? Of course. But it presents it as he is the first person to do so. He is the sole actor in violating these, concepts about, decorum or neutrality. And that's not true. Those had been violated by the left, since the 60s, repeatedly, over and over and over again, because it was a way to collect additional power, because it was a way to edge out your opponents. And look, ultimately, when I look at Trump, and I think that he did not create this, but he was an early adopter. He realized that this is the new way politics worked, which is the sort of gentleman's agreement of politics has been dead for decades. But only one party, only one side of that realized it. Mm-hmm. And the other party was, the Republicans, the conservatives, let's be honest, the normal Americans were operating like, Charlie Brown, right? Running up to the football again and again and again. And Trump basically said, like, yeah, no, we're not doing that anymore. I'm playing the same way. I am going to, violate these norms. And I think that growing up in an era where those norms were clearly dead, where that old order, that old way of doing things was ridiculous, and has been ridiculous my entire life. I mean, you have Obama, right, talking about how was it Trayvon that he said could have been his son,
Yes.
or
Yeah.
one of others.
It was
It
Trayvon.
happened a couple times, but stooping to that level, commenting that people in the Rust Belt were bitter clingers on, let alone all the other things he did going after the Tea Party. Once you know that, you're like, well, this is not a fair game. This is not, the Marquis of Queensberry rules where we, have a ref and, rounds counted out, everything is above the belt. Like, this is a very nasty, brutish thing, politics. And so once that's done, and once you've seen that, especially if you have no connection to an era where politics had the semblance of dignity and legitimacy, I think that's a large part of the explanation of the shifted mentality. That there's really never been a time where we saw the system working as intended. Like, look, I don't remember 9/11. I assume you don't either. So the normal times, the before times, when everything was assumed to be working, that's purely academic. And so I think that part of the reason you see this different tone is some of it's youth. Younger people tend to be more humorous, less serious. But I think also there's a recognition that the system's never really been working during my life, certainly during my adult life. So why do I take it seriously? Not to say that politics isn't a serious game, but the sort of artificial moral claims made, by the progressive left. It's like, well, okay, we care about the rules. Like, you shut down society because a guy passed a fake 20. Like, no, this is ridiculous. And so to get back to your point, sorry, I went on a little bit of a tangent there about, are there different subcategories? There 100% are. I think one of the biggest ones you are seeing is, and we're already seeing this now, is a massive speciation based on, effectively, are you interacting with women at all? Like, period.
Yeah.
And within that, what is your plan? Because, and I realize I live in a non-representative area of the country, but I see it elsewhere. I have friends across the nation. The difference between the people who get married under 30, who have kids under 30, and those who don't is night and day. And while that has always been the case, you see two radically different populations forming from that. I think of my immediate social group. I live in a conservative part of the Bible Belt. So, not representative, but it's probably 70% of my immediate friend group is married, all under 30, and about 40 to 50% with children. And okay, that's not horrifically early. It's not like these people are 17, but if you compare that to national averages and you compare that to the people who sort of went under for COVID and never came out again, right? Who just became these like bizarre, internet goblins. Those are two dramatically different populations. So are there divides? 100%. But I think that, given this kind of war between the sexes ramping up and really getting nasty on both sides, people are not having sex, people are not pair bonding. That's creating sort of a filter of who has been able to pass that test and be normal, to be blunt about it. That is creating two dramatically different populations. And it's not to say those who, have issues with women or have issues with men are unable to find a long-term partner or a husband or wife. It's not to say they're necessarily like bad or there's something wrong with them. Sometimes it's just bad luck, right? It happens. But over time, as those trends continue, I think we will see two dramatically different cultures, and we're already seeing the birth of those.
One thread I wanted to pick on is when you're talking about like, younger and older conservatives just viewing things different ways. There's one great example of this because it's from kind of the older era, and it's that interview between Bill Buckley and my favorite guy, Ian Smith, where I forget like the exact discussion, but it's about democracy. And Buckley says, well, shouldn't you let the cannibals, he doesn't say this exactly, but spiritually, shouldn't you let the cannibals vote to eat you if they want to? Because some of them are nice fellows. And Ian Smith is like, no, we're not doing like that. Well, why would we let them vote? They can't do it. And Buckley says, well, but like, what if they very much want to? And, it's they're talking about democracy and why Rhodesia should have it. And if you look at how that was received at the time, Rhodesia was a pariah state amongst most. And it's, well, of course they have to have full democracy. Whereas if you see this pop up now on Twitter, our crowd loves it. Because it makes sense. It's like, well, of course they shouldn't be able to vote. We don't want to turn into the Congo. And I guess, do you think that gets back to the Great Awakening you were talking about? Or do you think, like just us not wanting to put up with it, or people a little bit younger than us not wanting to put up with it? Or do you think that there are other, whether philosophical or just pop culture, political culture type reasons that the younger crowd, particularly the more right-leaning men in the younger crowd, are more hostile or more skeptical towards the idea of unfettered democracy or abiding by rules that only seem to hurt you, in a way that the older crowd, even if they have correct spiritual or even political motivations, really just seems often unable to get past that point?
Yeah, I think there are a couple things. I think one is that we have seen a number of unprincipled Schmittian exceptions where the rules were broken completely and totally. And the answer was basically because we're in charge and we do what we want. You can think of a recent, shall we say, a medical occurrence. I realize that's a word that's difficult to say on the internet, even still now. It sort of illustrates my point.
Mm-hmm.
What happened, with George Floyd, the 2020 election is another great example. And so, and over again, you've seen the stated rules of play, the way that you were supposed to do things, that you were taught how the system works in your high school civics class, violated. You start to look around and you're like, okay, well, if you can just do this, what's the point of me playing fair? Because you aren't either. And, I'm an idiot if I, assent to these rules fully. I think another part is that for younger people, the stakes are higher. So when I say this, I mean not all, genuinely. But you look at the baby boomer generation. They grew up in an era of massive abundance. You have both the sort of establishment of America as a world superpower post World War II, an immense amount of economic gain from the Marshall Plan and some other things. And so the system of beliefs that undergird that system, democracy, the kind of ideology first of the 1960s, and then on the right, the kind of Reaganite reaction to that. For that generation, it was a miracle. It worked like nothing else ever had. So you can understand why, when challenged, they go back to those principles. They're like, well, this worked for us. This was great. And the generation after that, Generation X, they certainly had access to proportionally less economic opportunity than those before them, but still pretty good. They existed obviously during the Cold War, but it seemed as if, the wall fell, we did it, history is over. We don't need to fight so much about politics. Now, I'm again painting with a broad brush. For millennials, we have clearly, growing up or kind of entering the workforce during the great financial crash, an immense amount of privation. But they had sort of their own answer to that. What is the answer to the sins of both America on a social level when it comes to racism, but also, for, let's be honest, some backlash to the Bush era adventurism, and then also this economic crisis? It was the messianic figure of Obama. That is who's going to save us. Clearly, we were not adhering to effectively the values of the 1960s close enough, that we weren't devoted enough to our God. So instead of offering, 300 virgins, we'll offer 3,000. That will appease it. We will do the old thing harder, do it more. And people don't remember this. I was a bizarre child obsessed with the news at the time. And I remember watching the reaction of progressives to Obama, and it genuinely was messianic. Similar, actually, you saw this in George Floyd, but there were these kind of bizarre baptisms done around Obama, in the same way that at the site where George Floyd died, they had these bizarre rituals, which no one remembers, but they did actually do baptisms at the site of George Floyd's killing. Very weird. But there were these kind of essays written almost in religious ecstasy. This is weirdly enough where you saw the birth of the libtard votive candles. You still kind of see them around with like RGB or whatever on them. That started in that era. It was bizarrely like religious in nature. And so that idea, that politics, and especially also, let's acknowledge this, the birth of, like social media and social media activism, like that's going to be the thing that fixes it. And let's be honest, it did not. Obama made nothing better. Not that this matters, but this is one of the things that triggers me more than anything else is used car discourse, where old people try and tell me that used cars have not, in fact, gotten more expensive. Just a little bit of background. I paid my way through college flipping used cars. I know that, I know how to do this. I've I used to forge my dad's signature to sell cars in high school. Allegedly, that's a joke. If that's still a crime, I assume that statutes of limitation will protect me. If it is a crime, that was a lie, and I said it to make Will laugh. But in all seriousness, so this is something I followed, and Cash for Clunkers, right? Something Obama did, destroyed the used car market, right? Predictably, it made it very, very difficult to buy a decent used car. And so, not only did he fail to stop racism, quote unquote, did he fail to stop foreign wars? Did he fail to stop the banks or make healthcare affordable? As I'm sure all of our listeners are aware. But basically, that sort of upswelling of progressive, feeling what would become the woke movement, it was exactly what power wanted. It was exactly what the regime, right? Whatever they are, they got what they wanted. And so, again, we see over and over again the kind of ideology of, let's just say, like the Fourth Republic of America, the post-World War II America, sort of echoed back and forth. And much like making a photocopy of a photocopy, each time it's lossier. You lose the definition. You lose the strength to it. And so, if you, like generations you often did, grew up in an era of that kind of like millennial, woke explosion, the idea to return to the founding values more stridently than before. We weren't devoted enough. And during that whole time, everything has gotten worse. And similarly, the bribe, right? Your economic opportunity, which is basically the payment for not making yourself a political nuisance, is decreasing. It's like, well, be honest, man, what do I gain from this charade? Like, not to say that there aren't good jobs that you can't buy a house, but to say, like, to be honest, man, it's like the payoff is really not worth it. Like, you can go and, cower, you can, shut up and take your abuse during, your corporate diversity training, or, when you're forced to write these statements at college. Like, yeah, you can do that. But what are you getting on the other end? The Bloomberg is reporting now that economic prospects for young white men in particular, who do and do not have a college degree are exactly the same. Literally 1-to-1 parity. So, like, be honest, like, what's your reward for, biting the pillow and taking it? Nothing. The answer is nothing. The answer is you are giving nothing. And so in that situation, it's like, well, there's no real reason to anymore. It's lost both the ideological, or I guess we'd say the philosophical trappings that made, progressivism, that made the kind of old school values that both sides adhered to. It has lost its ability to be seen as sacred. It no longer has a sort of air to it where people feel guilty about joking. But also the threat that you'll lose access to a job, you'll lose access to, certain economic advancements. Well, that's gone too. And so basically you're at this position where it's like, well, I don't really gain anything from agreeing with you. But in order to do so, I have to embarrass myself. I have to, become this sort of ridiculous TikTok twink. And so I'm not going to do that. And I think that's a large part of it, basically a recognition that, there's no place for me in this system that's actively hostile to me. So why would I index with it? And I'm not saying all, there's certainly guys who are doing quite well for themselves, who are, who are advancing through academia, but we're talking in averages here. And so I think that that's a large part of the reason for it. And also you see it even in specific issues. This cuts across both the right and the left. and the left was sort of first to this issue. But I think that, to be honest, Israel and our relationship to Israel is probably the biggest example of that. Where the kind of boomer libs, the older libs, they feel very uncomfortable with the pro Hamas radicalism of their children and grandchildren. And I wouldn't say I see many young men on the right, like in love with Hamas or in love with Palestine, but they certainly do not have the sort of slavish devotion that their older peers do. And these group chat leaks are a great example of that. You have jokes that I will not repeat for the sake of this podcast, about Israel's outsized influence on American conservative politics. That you and I are like, oh yeah, that's funny. Yeah, I mean, I might have said it a little better, but it's nothing that you and I would consider, really even shocking at all. It's sort of milquetoast. Whereas for those of a different generation, it is a moral crime of the highest order. And look, like I really do not want to get into a long discussion about the state of Israel, but that issue is there's more to that issue than the actual argument about foreign policy. It is a sacred cow that is well and truly dead, but only for some people. And so I think that a lot of the angst you see is some people, seeing, this issue as being, a moral decider of the highest order. That it's like they look at someone who doesn't support Israel the same way you look at someone who says the age of consent should be lowered to 12, right? Like it's just completely and totally off the table for good and decent people. And so, yeah, I think that that's a big part of it as well, Will.
Well, I wanted to ask a follow-up on that and was hoping to get to it because I don't know, I like the mix of hesitation and celebration that comes like in regards to that and changing attitudes around some of these things, I think comes from, on one hand, a lot of opinions, or at least policy preferences as informed by opinions, or at least somewhat better for heritage American people now. Like, whatever MAGA does is probably better than whatever Bush does, et cetera, down the iterations of that. But on the other hand, a lot of the influences are far less serious and probably more deleterious that led to that. Like, to not get too controversial with names, like Andrew Tate's a great example. Where on one hand, the like Gen Alpha or Gen Z people I know who like know of him or somewhat fans of him have very good opinions on a lot of things. But on the other hand, he's like a buffoonish, like shirtless pimp who lives in Romania. And it's really hard to be like, yeah, I want to be on the side of that guy and his influence. And that applies to the Israel issue and then, gender wars and race issues as well, where it comes up a lot with some of these online personalities. So, how positive are you, or where do you think that's headed? Where on one hand, the drift in opinions or the Overton window shifting does seem to be improving very much in the way that, someone where I feel like I'm more on the, natural high Tory right or the older right. It seems to be going the way I would, hope it would in many respects. But on the other hand, yeah, the influences pushing it there seems somewhat, deleterious spiritually and just like unserious people, which I dislike. So I was wondering, I know that's a long question. How do you feel about that, general question or the general situation presented by it?
Yeah. So there are a couple things, which is one, the Andrew Tate sort of falls into that same we'll use the term gender slop. I stole it from somewhere, I can't remember, but he's a good example of that. That he is sort of feeding into that war between the sexes. It's like, oh, here's how you one up women in general as a class, teaching you, how to act. And I think one thing that's worth saying is that he's not the first version of this. Like, do you remember Dan Bilzerian from like 10 years ago?
Yeah.
Where it's like, it's the same person, kind of, not literally, but like sort of copied the same grift. So I think that kind of guy just always exists. And I think that the right-wing politics are more a function of him existing on the internet as it currently is than Andrew Tate having any particular insight on the issue. I don't know what Dan Bilzerian thought, but I'd be surprised if he hadn't, said one or two things about new atheism, because that what was big on the internet when he was around. And I'm not trying to be dismissive. I really know nothing about Dan Bilzerian or Andrew Tate. I try to avoid that as much as I can. But the broader problem of internet influencers One, I think it's hard to put to really say, what is the cause and what is the effect there? How much of this is simply the internet in general is trending right wing because young men are. So, people drawn from that population are pulling in one direction. But honestly, I think that a lot of that is a sort of misplaced and I guess kind of lacking confidence reaction to like the progressive regime cathedral, as Moldbug called it, which is basically, how do you sort of thumb your nose at them? Well, they really, really hate Andrew Tate, the Sneeko, the kind of like, try not to use disparaging language here, but that kind of attitude. And so I think that for a lot of people, especially younger guys without, a lot of confidence, that fits in well. Because it's like, oh, hey, I hate that. Who do you hate? Those are my guys. And let's be honest, I've certainly been there. That's how I ended up, in a certain segment of politics. But I think that will probably decrease over time for a couple reasons. And I think you're already starting to see this, which is that hard right politics are mainstreaming from not everyone and not to the ultimate degree. But I mean, you and I have a handful of friends in common who have been on the biggest podcast in the world, right? Tucker's show. Like, between the two of us, we have some decent reach, but, not that much, right? Not enough to have, I've, multiple guys who've been on Tucker where it's like, I've gotten dinner with them before. Not at all supposed to be like any sort of humble brag, but to say like, even the relatively niche segment of the online right you and I exist in is getting closer and closer, certainly much closer than it was 2 years ago, to normal culture, right? The halls of power. And so I think with that comes a couple things, which is one, when any idea is mainstreamed, it gets kind of stupider, or at least the popular conception of it gets stupider. I realize the irony there, because it is massified. It's being brought to more people. For instance, like the meme of trickle down economics. Now I realize that came from, a liberal speaker, but that is effectively a really dumbed down version of side of supply side or stuff, which, I may or may not agree with. I'll be honest, I don't really know that much about economics, but there's much more to it than just that simple meme. But in order to be expressed in a way that everyone can understand it, or everyone at the very least can have an emotional response, positive or negative to it, it needs to be dumbed down. That I think is impossible to avoid. But I think that the growing up process is happening. And I think a lot of that is a filtering process. That, look, man, like I like joking around on the internet. I certainly, put out work that's not particularly serious. And that's fine. But also I think that some of the worst behavior, even if it is funny, of the online right really is a function of the online right being made up of largely young men acting anonymously on the internet. And especially in a situation where those are the most provocative, the most inexcusable things to say, there's going to be a race to the bottom because it's like, oh, here's the one place I can say the no word. So I'm going to say it all the time. So I think that as there's a mainstreaming effect, there will be both a dumbing down and also by necessity to appeal outside of, the immediate, existing kind of sphere. People will have to grow up. You're already seeing that kind of filtering process and basically who's being called up. So you look at someone like Oren, right? Like Oren has very subversive ideas, particularly, to be employed at the company he is employed, which I am both thankful and continually amazed by. I'll leave it at that. But, he has opinions which are very, very radical, but he's an adult, genuinely. He doesn't use racial slurs. He doesn't fly off the handle. And it's not because he shares the same progressive pieties about those words. It's just, it's impolite, right? It is off-putting to people. And I think that, you're seeing that sort of filtration process. And that doesn't mean that the kind of edgy internet and on right needs to go away. It's just that it cannot be both. It cannot be both kind of a hyper edgelord niche thing and something mainstream, right? There either needs to be a transition, right, where there are sort of people who can walk in both worlds, or there needs to be kind of a filtering or growing up process, which again, like I said, I think is already happening. I think as well, part of what you're seeing is that what was previously shocking is now returning to kind of normal discourse. For instance, like the word retarded is now completely fine to say again. That was very much not the case for the previous 10 years. Using gay as an insult and then a 3-letter, pejorative as well. That is slightly edgier, but not much. Let's be honest. That's something that you can just do now. And so I say both of those not to, to gloat, although I might gloat a little bit, but to say like, I think also we are seeing a broad shift in moral taste that will probably make the value of being edgy in that way, it will just diminish it. Right. It's like, look, man, you have like, there's just not much fun to be had from, using certain words anymore. There are still some that will definitely pause a conversation, but it's like, I think that, that edginess required overbearing woke morality to be fun and funny anymore. Like in a vacuum, there was just nothing to it, really, just like simply being, edgy for edge's sake. But by having something to fight against, that's what made it so intoxicating, because you really were, David up against Goliath. And that is still the case, but I think in a diminishing sense. So anyway, that's probably a convoluted answer to that question.
Just to kind of follow up on that point, without giving any personal details away for you, you've hit the milestones in life that like we would want guys our age to be hitting, just in terms of what you've been able to accomplish personally and professionally. Do you think the influences that are winning people over, like Candace Owens or someone who's just a buffoon, do you think that that's getting in the way of achieving things in real life, whether politically or socially or professionally, that we would want our guys to be doing to be a vanguard? Or do you think that the general trends are good enough that it's a good thing? I don't know quite how to ask that question, but it's something I've been struggling with.
I know what you mean. Because Candace Owens, I find her personally distasteful and embarrassing in kind of an extreme way. But then I also realized, I was like, and this might be a little bit elitist, but is anyone who likes Candace Owens likely to be doing anything important?
That's true as well. Yeah.
That is something I considered almost immediately afterwards, which is like, well, if this sounds good to you, you're probably not who we're looking for, at least for this sort of role. And so to me, I look at that as the sort of, massification of an idea. It's getting stupider, it's getting dumbed down, it's getting pushed out to a wider audience. And that is part of popularizing any idea, in the same way that, the kind of like woke progressive politics that bedroom feminists were whining about in 2014 was kind of a stupid version of, bell hooks and Audre Lorde, who, while I don't like them, they are more intellectual than that. That is going to happen no matter what. And do I think the internet is a possible distraction? I certainly do. But one of the things that I've noticed and really been encouraged by is the degree to which I see our political peers organizing. I mean, look, in a couple days, you and I are going to a conference together to hang out. And this conference is not put on by a national organization. It's being put on by like 1.5 chapters of the OGC. Mm-hmm. Like, which are basically run by like a guy who crashed my wedding. Like, not to, demean him at all, but to say like, this is not a massive organization. And there are going to be, a number of very prominent figures there. There are going to be, over 100 guests in attendance. Like that's a real thing. Things are being done. And a political conference obviously does not a country save, but you compare that to, what was happening 3-4 years ago when you might get one or two. You had Amrand, you had what would become the OGC conference, which even then is only 4 years old. There wasn't much being done. And at this most recent OGC conference, a few months ago, I had the pleasure of meeting there are now multiple, which is also crazy to say, Virginia chapters. And I won't get into details of, who this was or where they are for obvious reasons, but I met another group of guys from, generally my state. I was talking to them and I was genuinely shocked by who I was meeting, because I've always met like well put together guys. There's kind of a general ratio of like normal guys to, lovable spurgs, we'll say. And one, that is getting better too. But when I talk to these guys, it's like, oh yeah, that's blah, blah, blah. He owns a concrete company, or that's blah, blah, blah. He owns a plant. He owns something. He is an owner of a business. And to me, that was a really really interesting interaction for a couple reasons, which is first, serious people are paying attention to the right. They're saying ideas are coming here that are coming from here that are useful to my life. And also the people I meet there are worth associating with, even if that is potentially risky for me. Certainly economically risky, right? You could, lose a contract. You could be in the local paper as, associated with XYZ racist. But the fact that there are people in a real professional field saying, no, this is worth my time. That's a good leading indicator. But also the guys I'm listening, and this was before I'd revealed my face. So I could kind of, as long as I didn't open my mouth, go wherever I wanted and no one would talk to me, which was kind of nice. I could just listen in on conversations, which now that I say it is a little creepy, but everyone is saying like, oh yeah, we're working on this project. We're starting this. We're building something. And a lot of it I, can't reveal in particular, but like there are groups that are gathering intelligence and, passing it out to people you've heard of. There are news stories you've heard of, you don't know about, that were broken from, a couple random anons working together in an organization to find out stuff and pass it to people who could popularize it. And so look, like that's one example. There are dozens of others of saying that, it's nascent. It's not done. It's not, a finished thing. But every time I go to one of these events, every time I meet our guys, I'm incredibly impressed by both the caliber of people we're getting and also the seriousness. Like, yeah, sure, there's joking around. There's people making the edgy jokes. That 100% exists. And there are still characters. There's still guys who are just a little bit weird. And, more power to them. Like they're what make it fun. But you get through that pretty quickly and you're like, okay, these are real people pulling in a real direction, like doing something. And they may not have institutional support. These guys, many of them feel like they have been blocked from the traditional halls of power, but they're doing stuff. They're building things. And I think that we've sort of gone through a couple stages. The first, which is just everyone screaming at each other on the internet. We're kind of through that. I mean, it still happens. Then it was everyone and their brother starts a publishing company. Kind of done with that. Then, now we're in the era of political organizations, and now it is basically, what are we building? And there are dozens of different projects. Some of them failed, some of them haven't. But to me, I think that the fact that I see capable, competent people taking time to devote their money, their energy, and their attention to not only just paying attention, but working on behalf of, the American radical right. I mean, honestly, man, like that's a huge white pill, as the kids say. And are there retarded influencers? 100%. I'm not going to deny it. Are there people who on balance are probably doing more harm than good? Yes. But two things. One, they offer you a lot of air cover because as long as you're not doing that, you're kind of beyond the pale. Like or not beyond the pale, but you're kind of beyond reproach. Like I even think about this with, like how much of the doxing goes into, certain figures and certain organizations that are not particularly serious. And look, do I think people should be doxed for their opinions? Well, not those type of people, right? I don't. But you know what? It's chumming the water. They're not paying attention to the real threat, to be honest, from their perspective. And yeah, I'm not gonna say that's a good thing that they're targeting those guys, but it is like, okay, fine, whatever, focus on that. You don't know what you're missing. So yeah, man, sorry, that was sort of another long rant from me, but you,
no,
you asked me to go on your podcast. I'd figure you'd get what you paid for.
Do you have time for one more question? I don't want to hold you too long because I know you have.
Yeah, I've got time for one more.
Cool. The last thing I wanted to cover is earlier you mentioned speciation, which I think is a great point because if you look at the different trend lines, there's like at least right now, particularly amongst younger people, the like people who are generally on the right trajectory and achieving things, then the goblins of various sorts, whether it's the gender goblins or the internet goblins or whatever. How do you see, as someone who has recognized it, that playing out over the long term? And for me, looking at it, it looks hugely positive for the right in that, the potential French revolutionaries aren't breeding. There's no next generation of Marats. On the other hand, it's of course sad to see and all that. So how do you see that playing out, and where do you think that's headed in terms of how it'll affect American politics and perhaps the youthful right?
Yeah, so this speciation has existed for a while. You've seen it. I mean, even the baby boomers, right? You have the strong gap between those who went to Vietnam and those who didn't.
Mhm.
And I think the tragedy or the defining, I guess, experience for people of our era was not Vietnam; it was COVID. And you saw that split already there. Look, man, like the reason I live in the town that I do is basically that I got sent back from school, couldn't stay, and I developed a friend group around who is normal enough to keep hanging out, right? Like who will do things, who will, even if it's not crazy, but have some people over, watch them do very basic things. Who
Mhm.
will live a normal life? Who's basically said, you know what, I don't care, I'll be fine, but I don't want to, confine myself to, a, a life of a prisoner for the sake of one Dr. Anthony Fauci. So I think you saw that split there. And really, that split was several things at once, which is one, again, that fairly basic, are we going to be normal question? Yes or no? Uh, but also, what is your relationship to one, authority, and two, when we say authority, what we really mean is kind of secular progressive normalcy, the kind of NPR brain, the Reddit brain, the kind of general received common wisdom, which was if you do this, you're a selfish, horrible person who wants to kill everyone's grandma. And effectively, if you were willing to say, yeah, no, I'm not going along with that, even if you didn't have the best reason, even if you were one of those, full on, WHO, conspiratards, well, you very clearly like reacted to that binary test with one answer instead of the other. And so I think that that's really the if we look at it in the broadest possible sense, that split, because even now I look at my acquaintances who went the opposite direction and it was dramatic. Are there some people who were, kind of reversed course? You're like, yeah, I probably overreacted 100%. Right. But I think that for a lot of people, it was sort of, to be honest, man, it was sort of fatal. Like even going down to, the kid who shot Charlie Kirk, right? He was by all accounts normal until COVID. And then that's when he basically got driven into, you know, weird sexual degeneracy on Discord, right? That's how he met his quote unquote trans girlfriend. That's how he got sucked into left wing politics. And look, that's a crazy example. Not everyone did that and went out and became a political assassin. But to say that, a lot of those same trends that existed for a long time, extreme internet addiction, social media addiction, let's be honest, like a obsession with like far left politics and like weird gender nonsense were radically accelerated. And even if you just consider that like a timeout, like you didn't necessarily permanently harm yourself, but you kind of took 4 years off from your normal development. Well, all of a sudden you're behind the curve. You've been basically left behind by your cohort who has taken that same amount of time to, get a job, settle down, get a house, sort of do the traditional or kind of walk down the traditional life path. As far as how I think that will affect things going forward, we've already seen the fertility data by both religious affiliation and political affiliation, which at current writing is basically the same thing. It's not entirely one to one, but it's pretty damn close. Which is that conservative Americans are actually conservative white Americans are one of the few groups above replacement. They're at like a 2-3 TFR, which, like, don't get me wrong, isn't like, it isn't like going to, set the world on fire. But when you look at liberals who I think are at like a 1.8 or a 1.9, like very, very low,
I think
like that is going to,
like one.
that is going to change the demography of America. Now, liberals have two buttons or two levers they can push, which is one, they don't have to reproduce sexually. They can get your kids. And this is really what we've seen a lot of, particularly in Virginian politics, right? Is the injection of the gender stuff to younger and younger children. And also the other option is we just let in 12 million illegal immigrants, and then we don't have to care. But I think that demography you're talking about, I mean, that's identifiable across the West. Dr. Ed Dutton has written a number of articles and then a book about exactly this, which is that if left hermetically sealed, every nation in the West would be far right within a few generations. Now, that's a big if. Immigration is another very real part of this. But effectively, for heritage Americans, quite simply, the libtards will not exist given current demographic trends. They are not able to reproduce. And look, the problem of women being generally much more progressive than men and having enmity one to the other is certainly there. But let's also be honest. I don't see that being a long-term problem. To be perfectly honest, it can certainly be a difficult problem for someone at a stage in life. But to me, I don't necessarily see that being a strong issue. And so effectively what I look at this situation as, and I stole this from a Twitter account, Black Horse, where he called it the Great Filter, or the sort of he had a better term than that. I can't remember it. But point is, describing it sort of as a genetic bottleneck in the same way that the Black Death was, where you had, an immense amount of bloodlines severed by this plague. And from a certain perspective, modernity is the same thing. But instead of your resistance to a literal physical virus, right, the bubonic plague, it's your resistance to a mental or social virus, basically. Can you say no to the current thing? And that goes back to COVID, right? That was basically, in one issue, your reaction, yes or no, to that kind of like virus of consensus, which, sure, your reaction to COVID, depending on who you ask, maybe, it didn't directly correlate to your overall fertility through life. It's not like you sign up to both get the jab and say, I will only have one child because I'm, waiting till I'm 40, but it's a pretty good proxy for it. And so, that's sort of how I see it affecting things over the next couple of years.
Great. Well, thank you for coming on. Where can people find you and find your work?
Yeah, sure thing, man. So the Jay Burden Show, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you want to listen to podcasts. The way my channel works is that if you want the episodes early and ad-free, you have to throw me a few bucks. You can do that on Substack, Patreon, or Gumroad. It's pretty easy, man. And again, Will, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Yep. Thank you for coming on. Everyone who listened, thank you for listening. See you again next week. Bye.